Hello, kia ora. That means hello in Maori, the language of the first people of New Zealand. Today, we're in our critter chat, we're going to talk about a New Zealand native that is found only in New Zealand and nowhere else, and is really one of a kind. Today, we're going to talk about an animal called the Tuatara. Tuatara are found only in New Zealand, and Tuatara, the word, means peaks on the back in Maori, the language of the first people of New Zealand. Those peaks on the back refer to their spikes that are along their spine. Those are skin folds, and they're more prominent in the males. And during the breeding season, he can kind of flare up those spikes and make them stand up a little taller. And he does so to try to impress the females. Tuatara are reptiles. They can live, or they can get to be about 20 to 30 inches long. They weigh about 1 to 3 pounds, so they're not super heavy because most of their weight, or most of their length, is made up with their tail. If you saw the photo that I posted earlier today, that is a Tuatara. I believe that one is a female because the spikes are pretty small. That is a Tuatara that I saw a couple years ago at the Auckland Zoo in Auckland, New Zealand. And although Tuatara look like lizards, they are not. They are reptiles, but they are the only surviving members of the order Rhinochophila, which is an ancient order of reptiles, ancient group, but big group, big. Like snakes and lizards are together in one order. This is a cousin order to them. Snakes and lizards are called squamata. These are the Rhinochophila. Sorry, Latin's tough. But they evolved 240 million years ago. That's in the age of the dinosaurs, and the order of Rhinochophila had many diverse and widespread species. There were carnivores, there were herbivores, and there were aquatic members. Today, there's one, the Tuatara. So it looks like a lizard, but it's not, for a lot of important reasons. Truly, they are a living fossil, or a living dinosaur in some ways, and they're one of the most unique creatures in the world in that there are no close relatives, but there's really not even any relatives of this species. They're super unique. And there's still a lot of research being done about them because there's some weird things that they've got going on that just don't really make sense to most scientific theory. For starters, they like cooler temperatures, which is really weird for a reptile. Normal reptile body temperatures, they're cold-blooded, they're ectothermic, they rely on outside sources to heat them. But most reptiles try to maintain an interior temperature of about 68 degrees, which is pretty cool. If it's 68 degrees, most people would maybe want longer sleeves, maybe a hoodie, longer pants. With Tuatara, their body temperature that they keep is regularly between 41 degrees and 52 degrees. So they are definitely a cooler living reptile. They actually struggle in temperatures above 75 degrees. So here in LA today, it's in the mid 70s. So this would be at the height of their top of their temperature range of what they can handle. For two, they have an extremely slow metabolism. And although some other reptiles experience that seasonally, Tuatara experience it throughout their lifetime. Most reptiles grow pretty quick. Most reptiles are able to reproduce at a fairly young age. Most reptiles can even move pretty quick when it's warm. Tuatara don't. They are slow. They have a slow metabolism. They grow up until they're about 30 years old. continually getting significantly bigger. So the big guys are at least 30, probably older than that. Most reptiles can grow a little bit throughout their life, especially true with turtles and tortoises and crocodiles. Actually, I think all reptiles do. But the Tuatara don't even get big until they're at least 30. They're still growing. They also essentially hibernate during the winter, which is true for some other reptiles like snakes and lizards that live in colder places. But these guys kind of take it to the next level. They also live a really long time. They may easily live to be over 100 years old. There's multiple individuals that have lived that long. And if you compare them to a snake or a lizard, which are in theory their closest relatives, none of those animals come close to living that long. The big lizards like monitor lizards, Komodo dragons, typically they're lucky if they see 20. Same with the big snakes, or most snakes typically don't live longer than like 20, 25 years at the most. Tuatara are living up to their hundreds. That's kind of crazy. That's kind of the ages of the other reptiles, the crocodiles, the turtles, tortoises. Tuataras are carnivores, so they eat other animals. They specifically focus in on things like insects, spiders, millipedes, some other small lizards, some small birds and bird eggs, and they'll even eat their own species if they're small enough. So the babies, when they hatch, have to be careful about the adult Tuatara that are around, because if they're hungry, they may not have a very long life. Like a lot of lizards, Tuatara can also regrow their tail, but Tuatara are some of the biggest animals that are capable of doing that. So if they get caught by something, has a hold of their tail, they can let it go, and it will slowly, very slowly, grow back. Tuatara also have a third eye, like a legit third eye. That's used metaphorically with a lot of things, but legitimately they have 3 eyes. When they first hatch, they have 2 in the front of their head, 1 on top. The eye on top has a retina, has a lens, has a cornea, has nerve endings. But by the time they're about 6 months old, it covers up with scales to where it's not really detectable anymore. Scientists have wondered what this third eye does, why they have it, how they use it, and they're still trying to figure things out. They think that the third eye can help establish the seasonal cycles, help them understand when it's the colder season, when it's the warmer season, wetter, drier, and also the times of the day, and really get that cycle down once they're little. Because Tuatara, unlike other reptiles, are mostly nocturnal. They're more active during the night, especially the adults. They're almost exclusively active at night. When they're babies, they're active during the day to avoid the adults so they don't get eaten. They also think that the third eye can help absorb ultraviolet light and rays, and they think that that's important for some reason, but they're still trying to figure out how that works and why it happens. They know that the third eye doesn't help with vision. It's not like they're staring up into the sky for any reason, but they're still really trying to figure that out. Truly a unique animal. They also are very slow at reproducing. They usually have to be about 20 years old before they are sexually mature enough to reproduce. That happens a lot with some of the slower growing reptiles, things like the giant tortoises. That's definitely true. I believe some of the crocodile species are kind of in that same boat. But with Tuatara reproduction, the males can breed every year during breeding season. The females, they can breed maybe every other year, or every 3 years. If they live in a really cold place, it's going to be closer to 5 years between breeding seasons. That's really slow for any species, really, but it's particularly slow for a cold-blooded animal. The females take a long time to prepare their bodies to have babies. It's almost up to 3 years for the eggs to develop inside, where the egg yolks are ready to connect with a potential baby in an egg. And then after breeding, it's another 7 months to develop the shell around that. And then once those eggs are laid, it will take at least 11 months to maybe 16 months for the eggs to hatch, which is one of the longest incubation periods of any animal that lays eggs on the planet. In colder places, it takes longer, and in cold places, the eggs, if it gets cold, can just kind of pause their development, and they'll wait until it's warm enough to continue again, which is pretty amazing. Scientists are doing a lot of studies about Tuatara to try to figure out how that works and how it might be beneficial for humans. In addition to that, when the females do lay their eggs, they lay their eggs in a burrow. Burrows are very important to Tuatara. They actually share burrows with a lot of birds. In New Zealand, before the arrival of people, there weren't a lot of land-based animals at all. It was kind of a bunch of birds, seabirds mostly, but there are some other ground-dwelling birds, and there's some parrots that live in New Zealand. And then the Tuatara was the largest carnivore on the islands. They live in the burrows of some of the birds, and they eat the bugs that kind of clean up after the birds poop. And occasionally the Tuatara will eat the little birds or the eggs, or occasionally the adults if they're big enough. But the female Tuatara, she lays eggs in the same burrows that she lives in, and then she covers those eggs up and kind of checks out. She's done. And she'll leave those eggs. They'll sit for at least a year before they hatch. And during that time, if there's anything around that eats lizard eggs, or reptile eggs, sorry, they're not lizards, reptile eggs, they can be in big danger. The eggs are only about an inch long, and when the babies hatch, she'll lay between 1 and 19, which is kind of an odd number, 1 and 19 eggs in the burrow. They're about an inch long, and when the baby Tuatara hatch, they're about 4 inches long, so they're curled up in that egg, and once they hatch, they're just little guys. I'll share some video and other footage later today that talks or shows what size they are. Like other reptiles, the temperature around can also impact the gender of the babies. That's true with crocodilians, that's true with turtles and sea turtles especially. It's the same with Tuatara. So as temperatures are warmer, more Tuatara babies are male, which could pose a significant risk as the world continues to warm through climate change. That can cause a huge problem in off-balancing their population, and it could be a significant problem with them since males can breed every year, but females takes multiple years before they're able to reproduce again. That could be a huge problem going forward with them. Now, one particular Tuatara, his name is Henry. He lived at a very special place on the South Island, on the Big Island of New Zealand, and he lived at a place called the Southland Museum and Art Gallery. He became a first-time dad when he was 111 years old. So they can live very long lives. They knew Henry's hatch date, and they knew how long he'd been at the museum. And they were able to have him breed with a female Tuatara who also lived at the museum. She was in her 70s, and when they had their babies, he was 111 years old. They had 11 babies together. And so they know that they are able to reproduce late into their life, which is some good news. Since they live a long time, that's some good news that they can reproduce. With the arrival of people in New Zealand came some threats to the Tuatara. The first and most important threat that came along were rats. Rats were not native to New Zealand. In fact, there were no land-based mammals at all. And rats would eat the eggs, rats would eat the babies, and if it was a big enough rat, it could even go after a juvenile, a medium-sized tuatara. And they figured that rats had wiped out the tuatara on the North Island and the South Island, the two big islands of New Zealand, about 200 years ago, with tuatara only surviving on the outer coastal islands. There was an island that they documented in the 1980s that rats got introduced inadvertently to, and in 6 months, the rats ate and killed all the tuatara that were on that island. So rats are a huge problem for many animals in New Zealand, but tuatara are one of those animals. Also, problems are dogs, cats, and unfortunately, New Zealand got some weasels introduced to it from the British, and the weasels have also decimated a lot of their animals. Because there were no native-based land predators other than the tuatara, there were no mammals. Many of the birds on New Zealand nest on the ground as well, and eggs, nest, chicks were all very much exposed to a lot of introduced species. So in 1895, the government of New Zealand realized that, one, tuatara were incredibly special and unique, and two, they were disappearing. So in 1895, this is one of the first wildlife protection things that happened anywhere on the planet. They put full protection on tuatara and tuatara eggs, protecting the populations that still lived on some of those little coastal islands off the coast of the Big Islands in New Zealand. After that time, they monitored and they figured out that the big problem was rats, and other problems could exist in some places. Sometimes there would be a fire or something else on an island, and if it burned throughout the whole island, it would obviously wipe out any of the animals that were living there. In 1988, the Department of Conservation created a very significant recovery plan for the tuatara, in which they worked with a handful of zoos, including that museum that's on the South Island, and the Auckland Zoo that's on the North Island, to create captive breeding programs. And they did something very important, that when the babies hatched, they would let them grow till they were big enough that they themselves wouldn't be food for rats or other potential prey. And then they started to reintroduce them to islands that they knew were rat-free. And they were able to do that and increase the amount of islands. They were on about 30 little islands, and they were able to increase that to 37 islands today. They still work with a lot of those zoos in helping raise awareness, and also very important to let people know, if they're visiting those islands, that they're not accidentally bringing something like a rat, a mouse, a snake, or any other kind of pest that could be a problem with them as they come to those places. With them only existing on limited island ranges, natural disasters can play a huge role in being a threat as well. Some of those islands are really small, like an acre or two in size. If there was something like a tsunami wave or a big hurricane or any of those things, it could cause a lot of problems. So they are still very much protected and respected in New Zealand, although on a scientific international scale, they are listed as least concerned as being endangered, because the population has grown significantly in the last 30 years that they've had the recovery plan. It is estimated that there are about 55,000 individual tuatara today, but they're still looking to do some more work and hopefully get them to continue to grow. There is a special little group of islands in between the North Island and the South Island that they noticed that the tuatara that live on those islands, they're called the Brothers Islands, that those tuatara are slightly different. For a while, they considered that they may be a different species of tuatara, and they've done genetic testing, and they figured out that yes, there's some differences, but it's still the same species, so it's a different subspecies. The Brothers Island tuatara are very rare. because they only live on 2 little islands. And in the 1990s, I believe, San Diego Zoo became the first place outside of New Zealand to officially house Brothers Island Tuatara. And they got 10 of them. They were 3 years old, and they're still at the San Diego Zoo in a behind the scenes area because they are specifically held in San Diego as a special reserve in case something were to happen to the population on those 2 little islands, like a big storm, a fire, a tsunami. There's volcanoes down there. Any of those things could cause big problems with those little islands in New Zealand. And San Diego Zoo holds a special agreement with the New Zealand government to keep that population safe. Now, so they were brought to San Diego in the 1990s, and they have 10 of them. They were 3 years old. They still have not reproduced, so they're hoping that they will. They're just now old enough to where that could happen, and they're monitoring them very closely. When they flew from New Zealand to San Diego, they flew on Air New Zealand, which is kind of the official airline of New Zealand as the country. And because they were very special and very important cargo, they actually rode up in the cabin with the people, which was the first time that New Zealand Air ever lifted their no animals in the cabin policy to fly those very special Tuatara to San Diego. Air New Zealand is actually a really great conservation partner. They give free flights to environmentalists and conservationists who are traveling with any of their native species throughout their islands to all the different cities. They do really amazing work in helping with the conservation of the native species of New Zealand. There is now in 2005, they created a 25-acre fenced in zone that is fenced with little tiny mesh fencing that's small enough to keep rats out, and they've introduced Tuatara into that reserve. I believe that's on the North Island. And a couple years later, they found a nest, and the next year they found a hatchling. So that is the first Tuatara that hatched in the wild on one of the main islands in over 200 years. So they are very excited about that. Our special shout out today is to the Auckland Zoo, who has done a lot in the captive rearing and head starting of the Tuatara and helping them to get big enough that they can survive on some of those islands that they've been introduced to. Tuatara are an animal that I learned about when I was studying to become a zookeeper in my zookeeper class. One of our instructors introduced us to them. I had no idea what they were. I had never heard of them before, and I thought, that's a weird little animal. Someday I'm gonna learn more about it. In 2018, I had the opportunity to visit New Zealand. When I went to Australia, I spent just a short time in New Zealand, and during my time there, I went to the Auckland Zoo. I saw the Tuatara, and I fell in love with them because they are so unique, so different than so many other animals here. And I'm really happy that New Zealand takes great pride in taking care of their native species and doing all that they can to help them thrive. Big shout out to Auckland Zoo and the role they've played in helping raise awareness about them, and also the special breeding that they've done behind their scenes and the head starting that they've done with some of those little babies that they've reintroduced. I'll be sharing some more information from the Auckland Zoo and also the Department of Conservation of New Zealand about Tuatara later today on the Facebook page. That's what I have for you today to share about the Tuatara. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you stay safe, be happy, be healthy. Kia ora. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.